So, good morning, friends. I am Dr. Salim, running an institution intervention for UGC Net English. In the last time, in July 2018, I sent 7 students from my institute for UGC Net English, and of them, 4 got qualified. And in that group, there is one girl who secured a JRF also. And her name is Reshma Das, and she is a person coming from Trivandrum, and my institution is also in Trivandrum. And there are the various ways of winning the UGC Net. So if we aim at JRF, we will be able to win Net. And in Net exam, especially English, there are 2 papers. One paper meant for general, and the next one paper based on literature, based on our subjects. And in the general paper, we come to find that there are 50 questions. And the only problem with the general paper is connected with the timing. Only 1 hour is allotted for the first paper. And there are 50 questions to be answered. And there may be questions from research methodology, teaching aptitudes, and communication. And at the same time, there will be questions connected with logical arithmetic. And if one spends too much time on arithmetic questions, he will lose the time to look for the general questions. And without answering the general questions, a person is not supposed to qualify in the paper. Minimum, we have to get 30 questions from the 50 group. And that alone will secure you a pass and some marks to be added for the next paper if the next paper comes to be difficult for you. Anyhow, the next paper, the second paper, is consisted of 100 questions, and they are purely literature questions, questions based on our subjects. And when we go into our subject, we find it begins from the early British literature and history to the postmodern times. There may be more than 50 questions asked from British literature, but there are also questions to come from the other literature areas also, from world literature like American literature, European literature, and then there is the continental literature, and there are also questions from Indian literature, Russian literature, and there are also questions coming from the prosody area. Prosody actually means the things connected with poetry and prose, the elements of prose and poetry. And there are also a few questions coming from the area. Then there is criticism also, and there may be also a few questions. And then there are the new trends in literature, and from that area also there may be questions asked. For example, in the last exam, there was one question asked about hyper-reality, and it is connected with Jean Baudrillard. And in that area, we come to find postmodernism and the trends in the post-colonialism, beginning with Edward Said, and then Antonio Gramsci, and Frantz Fanon, and Gayatri Chakravarti's Puvac, and Homi Bhabha, and there are a number of people connected with post-colonialism and the modern trends in literature. Anyhow, the literature from British area begins from the early British literature and history. The early literature of Britain, in that area we come to find a few questions asked. In the last occasion also, they asked one question to identify a dialect that was not in use during the Old English period. The Old English period is also called the Anglo-Saxon period. During the period, they used 4 dialects: Northumbrian, East Anglian, Mercian, and West Saxon. And in the last year question, so Irish was also included in the group. Irish is actually a language, and it's not a dialect. And therefore, the answer was Irish. Northumbrian, Mercian, and West Saxon are dialects used in the Anglo-Saxon periods. Actually, when we go into the early British history, we find that the Iberians were the people who came to Britain first, and they were followed by Celts, and Celts arrived in Britain in 600 BC, and they continued there until the coming of the Romans. The Romans came in 43 AD. And the first person who came to Britain was Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar came to Britain in 55 BC and then again in 54 BC, and he was attracted by the climate and the topography of Britain, and he wanted to have a full-fledged invasion of Britain. But anyway, he had no time because he was at the time looking for his Gallic invasions, including France, Luxembourg, North Italy, Northern Germany, and such places. So on the way he came to Britain also, and in his book Gallic Wars, he refers to his visit of Britain, his invasion of Britain. Caesar was a man of letters, and he produced a book called The Gallic Wars. And the Gallic Wars deals with the invasion of Britain also. In the 4th and 5th chapters of the book, we come to find his reference to his visit of Britain, his invasion of Britain. But unfortunately, he didn't have the time of conducting a full-fledged invasion. He was assassinated in 44 BC by Brutus, Cassius, and other conspirators. And the details can be found in Shakespeare's play Julius Caesar. There are a few historic tamperings, even when the history and the story of Julius Caesar can be found from the play by William Shakespeare. And then after the invasion made by Julius Caesar, there was nothing heard about Romans for another 100 years. And in 43 AD, when there was Claudius, the great emperor of Rome, ruling Rome, there was an invasion, and they invaded Britain and established the Pax Romana. They started the invasion in 43 AD, and they remained in Britain until 410 AD. And they left Britain in 410 AD, and the years that we have to remember always, because there may be questions asked from this area also. The period between 43 AD and 410 AD is marked as the period of the Romans. The Romans left Britain in 410 AD, and the reason why they left Britain was not known. And the people of Britain needed external support, some external support, because it was at the time the Picts and the Scots were plundering Britain, coming in the darkness of night, molesting the ladies and plundering the wealth of the people and burning the houses. In fact, they needed assistance from some external body, and they invited the Anglo-Saxons. And the Jews came there first. They established one kingdom called Kent. And they were followed by the Saxons. Saxons came there and established the 3 kingdoms, Sussex, Wessex, and Surrey. And the Angles were the last set of people who came to Britain, and they established the 3 kingdoms, Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia. And these 7 kingdoms came to be called Heptarchy, 7 kingdoms, and they were ruled by the prominent Anglo-Saxon rulers like Egbert. And Alfred the Great was the grandson of Egbert, and he became the prominent ruler of the Anglo-Saxon period. And he is regarded as the founder father of English Navy, and he promoted English language also. He made arrangements for the translation of Beowulf. Beowulf is one of the earliest of literary works found in English literature, and it came from Denmark or Spain in the form of ballads. Actually, the authorship of the poem Beowulf is not clearly known, and the poem came to Britain as ballad, and it was made into an epic tale, and the poem has got about 3,300 lines, speaking about the adventures of a Geatish hero named Beowulf. So he was a warrior during the time of Hrothgar, and there were the witches like Grendel devastating the country. And he fought with the witches and killed Grendel, his mother also. And after that, he became the ruler there, and he became a great ruler. And again, there was attack from the side of witches, and he was asked to fight with a fire-spitting demon, and he killed the demon. But in the fight, he was also mortally wounded, and he became dead. And the poem ends with the mourning on the death of Beowulf. The poem ends with the lament made by a Geatish old lady. Once Ugc asked this question, how the poem Beowulf ends. And the poem ends with the lament made by an old lady, Geatish old lady. And in the former year, there was one question asked from the Anglo-Saxon period. During the Anglo-Saxon period, they promoted English language. And the question from UGC was, who were the Teutonic people, the Germanic people who came to Britain with the seeds of English language and promoted it? And the option was the Normans, and then the Romans, and there was also the Anglo-Saxons. The right answer was the Anglo-Saxons. Anglo-Saxons were the West Germanic people who came to Britain with the seeds of English language and promoted it. And the major contributor in the Anglo-Saxon period is Alfred the Great, regarded as the founder father of English Navy, was a great lawgiver, and also he is regarded as the father of English prose. He started writing the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. Beowulf was translated in West Saxon language, and it has been included in a manuscript called Cotton Vitilis or Novel Codex. So the Old English literature can be found from a few manuscripts here. And one among the famous manuscripts was Cotton Vitilis or Novel Codex, and Beowulf is included in this manuscript. And in the same manuscript, there is one more poem added, and it is Judith. It speaks about a bold lady who is mentioned in the Old Testament, named Judith. She was a very bold and beautiful lady, and it was at that time there was the womanizing, molesting tyrant, Holofernes, Assyrian tyrant, molesting the ladies and seducing them. He was a womanizer, and he also used her to drink too much. And Judith went to Holofernes, submitted to his whim, and made him drink excess and killed him finally. And she came out with the cut head of Holofernes, and the soldiers of Holofernes ran away from the place. And she saved the place from the attack of Holofernes. And the story has been described in Judith. Judith is also included in the manuscript copy, Novel Codex or Cotton Vitilis. And during the period, there were the other writers like Caitman and Sinulf, and both wrote homilies, religious poems, and tried to make the Old Testament into a poem for people to read and understand. And they also produced the books to teach the commoners the Latin language, and both belonged to the monasteries of the period. And both were cowheads and illiterate people, Sinulf and Caitman. And Sinulf produced a number of homilies. And Caitman also produced the homilies from Old Testament. And these two people became poets through divine gift, and this is what Venerable Bede in his ecclesiastical history speaks about them. Venerable Bede produced his ecclesiastical history in 6th century, and the ecclesiastical history was translated under the guidance of Alfred the Great. Alfred the Great made the translation, he arranged for the translation of Beowulf, Judith, and the Venerable Bede's ecclesiastical history of English-speaking people, and from Nannius and Gildas. There were also people speaking about the Roman arrival and their fall and such things. And these were all made into translation under the guidance of Alfred the Great, and he promoted English language. And he started writing the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, and the Chronicle continued to be written until 12th century, and from there onwards started the writing of history, and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle has been so left out. Anyhow, it is a source of earlier life and historic incidents. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which was started by Alfred during his reign. And during the period, there were also the prose writers like Woolston and Aelfric. And Aelfric actually produced a homily on the story of Judith. And there were also the great elegies during the period, during the Anglo-Saxon period. And they are kept in a manuscript copy called Exeter book. And UGC is interested in asking such kind of questions. The old elegies can be found in the Exeter book. It's a popular manuscript during the period. And the popular elegies, the old elegies were Seafarer, the Wanderer, the husband's message, and the wife's complaints, and the Wolf and Eadweiser, Deer, and they were also called wisdom poetry. The old elegies were not elegies on the death of someone. Normally, elegies refer to the mourning on the death of someone, and pastoral elegies mourn on the death of shepherds. Normally, in a pastoral elegy, we come to find a shepherd mourning on the death of another shepherd. But the old elegies during the Old English period, the Anglo-Saxon period, spoke about separation, consolation, desolation, loneliness, alienation, and they were the subjects most often. The ruin of some city, the destruction of some places, the difficulties undergone by people during their journeys, and such all were the subjects for the Old English poetry. And Alfred the Great also contributed a poem, The Lay of Boethius. Boethius was a philosopher who lived during 3rd century AD, and the consolation philosophy of Boethius has been described by Chaucer also, and Alfred the Great produced The Lay of Boethius, and these poems are called wisdom poems, wisdom poetry they are called. Old elegies or the wisdom poetry. From this area, we can expect a few questions for the UGC exams. And during the period, the political instability during the Anglo-Saxon period, there were problems with the Danes. During the period of Alfred the Great, he allotted a province for the Danes called the Danelaw. And the Danes were asked to remain in their province and not to disturb the other areas of Britain. Alfred made a treaty with the Danes, and it was called the Treaty of Whitmore. And when his followers came, his successors like Ethelred the Unready, they found it difficult to permit the Danes to remain in the province in the same way. And Ethelred the Unready made a massacre in the darkness of the night, killing about 3,000 people, recorded in history as St. Brice's Day. And when it was known to Denmark, so Sweden from Denmark sent an invading army, invaded Britain, and Britain came under the Danish rule, and he made his son Canute to rule Britain, and Canute remained in Britain until 1035. And after that, Edward the Confessor became the ruler. Edward the Confessor actually re-established Alfred's reign. The Anglo-Saxon reign was continued by Edward the Confessor, and his pre-qualification was that he was brought up in Normandy. So the Norman authorities permitted him to be the ruler there. And he continued to rule, and he had no heirs, and then there occurred some problems connected with the barons. And the barons wanted to take up the rule of Britain, and a powerful invasion came from the Norman side, and the Normans invaded Britain in 1066 AD, the year of the Norman invasion. Normally, UGC is interested in asking questions like the invasion, the year of invasion of the Normans. And the invasion was made by William the Conqueror. Conqueror came there and invaded Britain and brought Britain under his control, introduced the French ways, and introduced the Salisbury Oath and Doomsday Book. And he was followed by William Rufus, then Henry I, and Henry II came as the first Plantagenets. And he continued to rule Britain. and he was followed by King John and Edward First, Edward Second. Edward Second we are very familiar with from the play written by Christopher Marlowe, A Good for Nothing King was he. He was homosexual also. And during the reign, his wife Isabella and her lover Mortimer, they organized an invasion and defeated him, and he was killed in the Berkeley Castle. Ugc also asked the question, Edward II was killed in which place, in which prison? He was killed at Berkeley Castle. And he was followed by Edward III, and during the time of Edward III, the French-British war, 100 Years' War started. And Edward III is regarded as pseudo-Arthur. During the time, he established the Arthurian way of adventure, and he produced his 7 knights, a round table of the 7 knights, and even changed the names of his knights into Bedivere, Percival, and the way of Edward III promoted the Arthurian legends. Actually, Arthurian legends were first introduced by Geoffrey Monmouth, who was born in 1100 AD and continued up to 1155. Geoffrey of Monmouth can be called the grandfather of English literature. So basically, English literature has been divided into 3 divisions. The Old English period from 600 AD to 1100 AD. It was in 1100 AD, Geoffrey of Monmouth was born. Therefore, the year is earmarked as 1100 AD, and from there begins the Middle English period, and it goes up to 1500. And during the period, there occurred the great vowel shift. And from 1500 AD onwards, we come to find the modern English period, including Shakespeare and all the great people. And when we go into the questions of UGC, we come to find that there are a few questions asked from the Old English. Some 2 to 3 questions will be asked from Old English. And there may be a few questions asked from the Middle English, from Chaucer also. Chaucer has written 24 tales, Canterbury Tales they are called, and he has got his prologue also. And he has got his poems also, short poems, dream and debating poems like Duchess of Blanche and House of Fame and Parliament of Fowls, and such poems are also there. And he has produced the Troilus and Cressida. And along with Chaucer, we come to find Gower also, William Langland. And they were the poets during the Middle English time. And during the period, we also come to find a few poems anonymously being written like Owl and the Nightingale, and Pale poems also, and they are the Middle English poems, Pale poems, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and then there is a special Pale poem also, and we believe that these 2 poems were written by the Pale poets. And they were poems like Cursor Mundi and Ein Bite of Invite. Such poems were also there in the Middle English period. And along with Chaucer, we come to find a few other poems anonymously being written during the period, and there were questions asked from this area also. In the last 2 occasions, they asked one question from Owl and the Nightingale. In Owl and the Nightingale, we come to find the 2 birds engaged in a heated argument. Owl, we know, is a nocturnal bird, a bird that wakes up in the night and squeaks in the night. And as far as the nightingale is concerned, it's a bird so interested in singing all through the time. And there is an argument between, a heated argument between these 2 birds. And they decided to go to a judge, and the judge is named Nicholas of Guildford. And we believe that the poem was written by Nicholas of Guildford, and it is attributed to him. And UGC asked the question, in Owl and the Nightingale, they decided to go to a neutral judge, and the name of the neutral judge was Nicholas of Guildford. It was one question asked from the area. And also there may be questions asked from the area connected with chronology. So to give an Old English poem and then to give a poem from the Middle English. For example, to give the poem Beowulf and then to give the poem Karasar Mundi or Ein Beit of Invites or the Middle English poem like Gawain and the Green Knight or the Owl and the Nightingale. So we have to put the poems in the chronological order. The Old English poem is followed by the Middle English and is followed by the Modern English. Normally there will be 2 to 3 questions asked in the UGC for arranging the chronology of the literary works. From Old English we come to find there are about 2 to 3 questions. From the Middle English there may be about 5 questions. So there may be some 2 to 3 questions asked from Chaucer and a few questions to be asked from Gower and Langlands. And then there are the Chaucerians also, the imitators of Chaucer, the English imitators as well as the Scottish imitators. And then the period shifts to the Elizabethan. During the rule of Elizabeth, England became a nest of singing birds like Sidney, Spenser, Shakespeare, and the other contemporaries of Shakespeare like the university. All these people covered the Elizabethan periods. And some of them extended to the Jacobean also. Elizabeth continued to rule Britain until 1603 and she became dead in the year. And she was followed by James. James came from Scotland. He was also a person belonging to the same dynasty and he established the Jacobean rule there. He arrived in 1603 and started the Jacobean rule. And the Elizabethan period extends to the Jacobean also. Shakespeare died in 1616 and he died in the Jacobean. And Shakespeare can be called both an Elizabethan as well as a Jacobean. And Ben Jonson also continued during the Jacobean period. He even continued in the Caroline also. He became dead only in the Caroline. So the literature of the Elizabethan and the Jacobean and the Caroline are interconnected. We come to find an extension of the Elizabethan to the Jacobean and the Caroline. In 1603, James came and started the Jacobean rule and he was followed by his son Charles I. And during the period of Charles I, there occurred the Bishops' War as well as the Civil War. And then he established the Inveraginum, what called Commonwealth. In the last time, UGC asked the question, the period between 1648 to 1660 is marked as what? It's actually the Inveraginum or Commonwealth period or the period of the Presbyterians or the Puritans. And during the period, the prominent writer is John Milton. John Milton started the Puritanic age. Elizabethan is followed by Puritanic period and Milton seems to be the prominent poet during the Puritanic period. And he was followed by the Restoration periods, the Restoration writers like John Dryden. During the Restoration period, there were the Restoration playwrights like Viceroy Congreve, Etheridge Vanbrugh, Durfee. And they spoke about sex instead of love. During the period of Shakespeare, it was romantic love. And during the time of the Restoration playwrights, so it was question of sex. And the plays were called the Restoration comedies. And Dryden also contributed a few Restoration comedies. He was a prominent writer during the Restoration periods. And his poems like Max Lucknow and Absalom Achitophel and his Annus Mirabilis, and there are a few poems also been written by him. Dryden also produced Masque and Opera, and he also made translation, and he is also called the father of criticism, the father of prose and criticism. He is called the father of prose and criticism by Dr. Johnson. And he made English criticism to have a firm stand. He introduced the historical criticism and comparative criticism. And the Restoration period extends to the period of the Augustines. Alexander Pope, Swift and Gay, these all people were there. They produced the Augustine literature. Dr. Johnson also was there during the Augustan period. At the end of the Augustan, we come to find Dr. Johnson, Oliver Goldsmith, and people like him. And then it was followed by the Romantics, and there is also a transition period. And questions can be asked from the Romantic period also, from Wordsworth, Coleridge, Robert Sedey, and the late Romantics like Shelley, Keats, and Byron. There may be questions asked there. And the Romantic period is followed by the pre-Raphaelite periods, promoted by Rossetti and his sister Christina Rossetti, A.C. Swinburne, and there were the other poets of the period. They produced the pre-Raphaelite poetry and pre-Raphaelite painting also. And then they were followed by the Victorians, and the major poets there are Tennyson, Browning, and Arnold, and there is also Elizabeth Barrett Browning. And the Victorian period is especially noted for its novels. Charles Dickens and Thomas Hardy are there, and William Makepeace Thackeray there. And Emily Bronte is also, Bronte sisters, Emily, Charlotte, and Anne Bronte. And there was also George Eliot, Anne Mary Evans, and she also produced novels during the period. And the Victorian is followed by the modern period, starting in 1922 with the introduction of Wasteland by T.S. Eliot, and there are the other writers like William Goulding, and the writers like D.S. Lawrence, E.M. Forster, Virginia Woolf, James Joyce, and all these people are there. And they produced the avant-garde movement in English. Avant-garde was a movement actually started in France, and it came to England also. And in England it was called the psychological novel or stream of consciousness novel. The prominent writers who handled the stream of consciousness novel were D.S. Lawrence, Virginia Woolf, E.M. Forster, and James Joyce. There were again a set of people. Then came the movement poets, and after that we come to find the modern writers like Doris Lessing, Muriel Spark, Anthony Burgess. To find the postmodern period or the surrealistic period also in English literature. Questions can be asked from those areas also, and we come to find the diaspora writers also, like V.S. Naipaul, Salman Rushdie, Timothy Moore, Sam Selvin, and Hamid Qureshi. There may be questions asked from the diaspora writers also. And the British literature actually begins from the earlier times and ends in the most modern, postmodern. So with the diaspora writers, the UGC syllabus covers all these areas. There may be about 70 questions asked from the British areas. And after the British areas, we come to find European literature also. European literature, including Indian literature in English. So it begins with American literature. Along with British literature, there is also literature from the various countries. World literature as a whole. Briefing of the world literature is also required. So in our institution, we have 4 typed books here, printed books. And the first book deals with the early British literature and history to the Elizabethan times. So it ends with John Donne, William Shakespeare, and all these people are covered in the first book. Chaucer, Gower, Langland, and all these people are covered in the first book. And the second book starts from the Jacobean period, 1603, and then it ends with the Victorian poets, Tennyson, Browning, Arnold, and Elizabeth Barrett Browning. Then there is the third book. So it begins with Victorian novels, Charles Dickens, Thomas Hardy, William Makepeace Thackeray, Bronte sisters, and it ends with the postmodern times and diasporic literature. And these all are the 3 books for British literature. And then there is also a 4th book, and it begins with American literature. So it includes the great American dramatists like Arthur Miller, O'Neill, Sam Shepard, Tennessee Williams, and then the novelists like Ernest Hemingway and Fitzgerald, and the beat movement also of the American poetry, then Sylvia Plath, And all these been included in the first part of the fourth book. This followed by Russian literature, Tolstoy and Maxim Gorky, and then Anton Chekhov, and such people are there. There will be two questions asked from minimum two questions. Sometimes there may be more than two questions from the American area, from Russian area also. It's followed by the French area, the European, and then the Caribbean or the continental like Chinua Achebe and William Nadim Godimer and Mol Soyinka, and such people are all being included there. Then Patrick White, then and there are also the Indian writers starting from Tagore, Nirati Chaudhary, Toru Det, Sarojini Naidu, and coming into the most modern times like Girish Karnad and then Betel Sarkar, and all these been included in the Indian area. And along with the Indian literature, we come to find, along with these combined literature, we come to find a few prosody areas also. And in the prosody area, we come to find certain terms connected with poetry and prose. And there may be a few questions asked from the prosody area, the elements connected with literature. And there are also questions coming from the criticism area and the linguistic area. Criticism area, we come to find Aristotle, Plato's dialogues also are there. And then there is Horace, there is Longinus, and Philip Sidney, and then Dryden, and Arnold, and T.S. Eliot, and the postmodern critics, Northrop Frye, and such all people being included in the criticism area. And after the criticism area, we come to find new trends in literature. And there is hyperreality, simulacra, and there are also trauma theories and theories like new feminism, and all these things being dealt in the new trends in literature in that area. And all these being included in the last book. And if you can make familiar with the notes, the printed notes, you will be able to go through the UGC exam, winning even the JRF. So for that, you have to contact me. I will provide you the notes, and at the same time, the online classes also. This time I do plan to wind up my speech. And I told you already that I have got 4 books in my institution, and I will send the books to you if you require them, so that you can go through the notes. In the last time, 75 to 80 questions were asked from my notes. So the notes are very simple for you to read and understand. And at the same time, I will provide you online classes. And if you have any doubts, you can contact me and get the doubts cleared. And I wish you all best for the coming NET exam. That will happen in December. And this is what they say, that there will be one exam in December. And I wish you all best for the exam to come. Thank you.